lunchtime. Heather Broomfield is a Ph.D. Fellow at the Institute for Public and International Law in the University of Oslo, where she is researching the data-driven public sector. She's also a senior advisor in the Norwegian Digitalisation Agency, and Heather has 20 years of experience with digitalisation, working in the public, private and research sectors in both Ireland and Norway. She recently led the Norwegian delegation for the Council of Europe's Ad Hoc Committee on Artificial Intelligence, and she served on the OECD's expert group on open government data and the European Commission's Public Sector Information Expert Group for many years. So we're in good company. So just to start the conversation, just to give you some sense of where we're going to go with this, we're going to just have some simple questions around what is AI and where we find it. And then we want to move on and discuss the intersection around human rights, democracy, rule of law issues, and the potential for discrimination. And then to finish, we're going to look at the relationship between the citizen and the public sector when it comes to datification. So this is pretty big stuff. I'm really delighted to be able to hand it over to ask you, Heather, to give us a sense of, just let's start simple. You know, we're hearing about AI all the time. It's here to stay. What is AI and where do we find it in our everyday life right now?
Okay. First of all, thank you for the introduction. I'd just like to remind everyone that the EU and the OECD use the word expert very broadly. So I'm probably not a huge expert really, but
I'd say you are.
Well, we'll see. Anyway, what is AI? AI is just very simply, it's smart machines that do jobs that would, an equivalent, if a human was to do them, would require an intelligence. That's like the very basic what AI is. Now you can go into all these huge technical whatever, but that's the basic fundamental of AI. It's been around for decades. A lot of what's been used now has actually been around for decades, and the difference now is the enormous amounts of data that we have, and Norway is a particular example of that, particularly for government data, which is why this PhD and other PhDs and research like it is very important. And the processing power that we have now as well. So it's all of that combined is really making like the potential of AI possible. You know, there's really, so much is possible with it. Where it is now, I suppose in our daily lives, Netflix recommendations, social media feeds. I mean, even if you hover now, like if you think about it, even if you hover on something on social media, the next thing that comes up is something related, right? That's AI, and that is the speed at which it manages to kind of predict, and that's the basis of AI as well, is about prediction. You know, it's about classifying and predicting. Self-driving cars, so we're not quite there yet, but Tesla is a perfect example, and very many cars now, you know, for driving would use a lot of AI. And that's kind of in the private sector. Health, for example, X-rays, reading X-rays now much quicker than it was. Even I suppose in terms of like during COVID, the vaccines hugely helped by AI, mapping the genome, the sequencing as well, like was much quicker for COVID than it was, let's say, for SARS because of AI. So we're really seeing it in daily life. But at the same time, and particularly where the public sector is concerned, we're still also in the early phases. And that's that kind of, hopefully we still have some time to kind of make sure that we do this responsibly, so that it does get used, right? That's what we want. Yeah. We want AI to be used.
And I just when we were talking earlier, you know, AI has huge benefit. It really can be of service to us all. But we're at this wonderful stage, and people like you are making sure that it's used in the best way, because it also has the potential to go incredibly wrong. And maybe we could talk about that then, that if you could give just around, you know, when I heard of AI first, I didn't immediately think of human rights, discrimination. I'm a little bit aware of how democracy is becoming more and more vulnerable because of the use of AI. So maybe can you talk us through that intersection?
Yeah, and the best way to do that probably is through examples, right? That's always
brilliant.
the best, so I'll give a few examples. I mean, I suppose if you think of a case that was common, that this is a very small example, I'll get into bigger ones now in a second, but just kind of, and how it impacts lives as well. I mean, last year with the predictive grades, for example, in both Ireland, so Ireland had it with the Leaving certificates, so there's Irish watching here, you remember that with the Leaving certificate, with the Norwegian one, it was the International Baccalaureate, and the predictive grades were wrong. Right. But of course, there was no time to change that and to adapt it. So, you're talking about many students lost maybe a year or the opportunity to get into the course that they could get into because the predictive grades were wrong. So there's real life impact when this does, is wrong. And then maybe an example from the private sector. This is a very well-known one actually with Amazon. And this actually never went out into production, right? But it shows you the kind of discrimination that can happen and because of bias that's in data. So the Amazon one was about recruitment. They wanted to do a recruitment AI to help them. Obviously, they get an enormous amount of applicants for their jobs. And the system was found to discriminate against women, to be gender discriminatory, even though the gender wasn't in it, right? So the gender wasn't in the data, male, female wasn't in it, so that was taken out. So, in theory, the bias was taken out. But the machine still managed to understand if it was a woman, a male or a female. So, for example, the president of the Harvard chess team, she was excluded, and they worked out that it was a woman. And why was it discriminatory against women? Was because the data was biased against men, because it goes back quite a number of years, and middle management, etc., were men. So the computer, the AI worked out, well, we should have men here. We should have this type of person here, based because of the bias in the data.
Wow. So,
right? Yeah.
Yeah. That's very frightening.
Yeah.
And so that kind of makes me feel like we can't trust AI, or is it the people behind creating the parameters by which AI is operating? It's very black and white. Is that what there's no nuance?
It's very difficult to know where there will be bias and how the AI is thinking, but there is a huge amount. I mean, there's a lot more.
Heather, but can I just stop you there for a second?
Yeah.
You just said how AI is thinking.
Oh, right, sorry, okay.
No, but
I get you, right?
No, but obviously I hear people refer to AI as them, they. I mean, is that where we're going? Because that makes me afraid.
Yeah,
to tell
thinking,
you
I shouldn't use the word thinking, I should have said working. And that's the thing as well. I mean, we can get into the whole chatbot thing, the female chatbots, the female names as well. And we do kind of humanize them to an extent, and we need to stop that. So,
we do need to stop that.
Yeah, we do need to stop that, right? So
back Amazon.
Yeah, back to Amazon. Yeah. So that was, but Amazon discovered this, and that's the point. It's about discovering it before it happens, right? It's about understanding so much of this is unintended consequences, and that's what's really happening in the public sector. It's these unintended consequences of AI. There isn't there might be in some places, but there isn't some evil person there working out about how AI is going to do this. It's the opposite. We're realizing that there's so much of this is unintended. We're realizing that there's so much bias in the data, more than we might have expected. And how do we identify that? And that's about getting in a way beforehand with the right questions. And that's a lot of what I'm trying to do with my PhD, is kind of trying to work out, particularly from a policy level, how we can frame and implement and understand this to avoid these unintended consequences. A very prominent human rights lawyer called Philip Alston came up with he says we need to avoid stumbling zombie-like into a digital welfare dystopia, and it says it very well, because it's this, we need to think about it, right? We didn't think enough about social media and potential consequences. We didn't think enough about that the internet was not just an opportunity, but also had a dark side. Mm-hmm. And that's what we need to do with AI as well. And imagine where we could be now, and how safe we might feel with our smartphones and our children having smartphones, etc., had we done some more of this thinking prior, earlier on, but we were and I was included in that huge sense of urgency. This is a huge innovation, something that we really need to hop on board with and be gung-ho with, and self-regulation, let innovation happen. We're now really seeing that we need to balance this out, that we can't just leave this.
We're seeing this while we're in the middle of a mental health crisis.
Exactly.
Where young people have never felt so lonely. So what you're saying is, we're not just young people in us all, we're on our phones. And obviously COVID has had an impact as well. But what I hear you saying is that we're at this point, we're at this threshold. You can go one way, you can go another. And I hear you use the word urgency. And I think anyone who's working or living at the moment around climate crisis, we hear that word an awful lot. We have till 2030, 2050, we have to do it, innovate. But you're saying, let's reflect, let's talk about the ethics, and that we're conscientious. So what
and that doesn't exclude innovation, because I think we need innovation. That's the point, is if we can be innovative around how to deal with this, then we're going to have really great products, right? It's the companies that actually innovate to get this balance are going to be the ones who will be the most successful going forward,
But with innovation, there's a lot of talk as well about fail. Sorry, I
fail fast, fail.
We can't really afford to do that right now, because or can we?
Yeah. I mean, we're going to make mistakes. We're not going to get this all right, and that's what we have to accept as well. But this is not food, and so that's always a balance there. But I think that whole fail fast, fail often thing, at least in the context of the public sector, we really need to question. And I'm talking now within the context of the public sector. And not the private sector, because the public sector is very different, with very different responsibilities. I think maybe then we'll talk into some examples, because I've done the Amazon, which is a private sector example. But if we think about public sector examples of issues with AI, maybe I'll start in the States. There's the Compass example, which was found to be racially discriminatory. It's about recidivism in the courts, so about whether the chances of reoffending. So in this case, a white person, despite having a much longer rap sheet, was predicted to have a lesser chance of reoffending than a black person with a much smaller rap sheet, just very minor crimes. So, and this was found out, right? So we learned from this, we learned from mistakes. Civil society in the States is very active here, very active academia as well, because the States were probably the first as well to go out with this and to really understand the implications of this now. And it's not solved yet, and far from it, but it's just about this. There's becoming huge awareness around this. Then two examples from the Europe then. So both of them actually stemming from the Netherlands, and I want to stress I'm not hanging out the Netherlands here in any way. It's just, but it shows that this can happen in the Netherlands, it can happen with any country, including Norway.
Is the Netherlands particularly advanced in terms of its use of AI, or?
Not particularly, but they just happen to have two cases which are particularly serious. One it's called Siri, SYRI now, not the Apple, not the iPhone or the Apple Siri. And this was about welfare fraud, right? So it was an AI created to assess chances for welfare fraud. It was found to discriminate against people from minority backgrounds, low-income neighbourhoods in particular. And that was civil society brought the case. So this is the reason why this is important as well, is it actually went through the courts. It's one of the very few cases that around AI that's actually gone through the courts and the public sector. So it was found to be contravene the European Convention on Human Rights. It was found not to have a balance between privacy and the public interest. So this was quite a big case. And the other interesting point about this as well was that the government said, or the public sector said, well, this actually isn't making decisions. This AI isn't making decisions. All that it's doing is a decision support tool, right? And that was the court ruled that even when it's a decision support tool, you're still classifying, you're still discriminating, the system is still assuming that people from low-income neighbourhoods are more likely to commit welfare fraud than people from other neighbourhoods. So you bring that in. The other case then actually it's not purely an AI case. The Siri case is a purely AI case. The other case isn't, and it actually brought down the government in the Netherlands. And this was about child benefit fraud. So the policy in the Netherlands was zero tolerance for child benefit fraud. So for kindergartens, like, Barnehagen here in America, or here in Norway, parents, it was means tested. So if you earned under a certain amount, you qualified for help with kindergarten fees. Mm-hmm. But there was a zero tolerance here to fraud, complete zero tolerance. The government really cracked down on it. And one strike and you were out, right? Or one strike and you had to pay back the benefits that you'd received, because you automatically got them, right? And then they did the checks. Okay. So they set up an AI for this, and quite, I suppose, in today's terms, quite a basic AI. And this AI was it exacerbated the problem, right? So for example, one of the criteria was if you were foreign. So you and I would have automatically, both of us are Irish in Norway. Had we been in the Netherlands, we would have automatically been predicted to have committed child benefit fraud purely because of our nationality. So 25 to 35,000 people were impacted by this, right? And it had huge knock-on effects, because immediately the government said you need to pay back this money. There was no
families with small children.
Families with small children, right? Yeah. For some people, they had to actually borrow to pay back the debt, even though they had done nothing wrong, so they weren't guilty at all. They had to borrow to pay back the debt. They got into debt spirals. I've heard that nearly 1,000 children have been taken from their homes, and there's a lot of very serious consequences for this. Now, I'm not saying that the AI it was just that the AI exacerbated the problem, right? So it wouldn't have been 25 to 35,000 people. The other thing that they've discovered is that 94% of the people, those 25 to 35,000 people, probably did not commit any fraud whatsoever. Wow. So this is a huge scandal in the Netherlands, and as I say, it brought down the government. Now the same government got back in again, but it's really having wide repercussions now. It's not seen purely as an AI case, because it's not purely as an AI case, but it exacerbated the problem. And that's the issue with the public sector. We have this huge societal responsibility. Our customers are everyone in society, and we need to be thinking really, really carefully about what we do, so that we get that balance and don't discriminate.
But how? So you're saying that civil society brought that case?
Yeah.
And what are the questions that the public sector? What are the safeguards that we can put in place? Because it's very important. We're not anti-AI, and I hear you say that. But what are the questions that the public sector really needs to put out front to ensure that 35,000 families are not the lives, even if you take it to Leaving Cert students, their whole future, that's completely out of their control. Yeah. So how do we prevent these things happening? And I know this is what your PhD is looking at.
And if I had the answer, if I had the actual answer for you, I wouldn't be doing a PhD. I'd be worth millions. Okay. So no, I'm just kidding a little bit, but I think your point there is safeguards. I mean, we are still, and that's going to happen. We are still going to make mistakes, and I think that's kind of like that social kind of contract we're going to have with, around this, is recognize that we're not going to get all of this right straight away, that there will be unintended consequences. But what we can do is start to put some really good safeguards in already. Like, so even in the Netherlands now, they have human rights. They have people with responsibilities for human rights. dealing with all of the AI applications, for example, going forward. They also have these algorithm registers, so all algorithms coming from the public sector, for example, need to be registered. We have other examples as well, like in the UK, they have the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation. We see a lot of kind of data ethics boards coming up in many countries. We don't.
Can I ask you something?
Yeah.
Is this recent, or when would that have started to happen, that we see these centres in place?
It's recent. Now, the UK, the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation it must be about 4, 5 years old now at this stage.
Okay, but that's
yeah. So it depends what we mean by recent, I suppose. Mm-hmm. And these academia is getting more and more engaged now as well. Right. We see civil society getting more engaged. Access Now, Algorithm Watch are two very good civil society actors in Europe, asking very serious questions and being a watchdog. And I think one of the safeguards that the public sector really needs to start doing as well is engaging more with civil society, engaging more and getting the questions, because it's not necessarily the answers. The answers it's knowing the questions to ask, right? Knowing what they should be considering. Another thing that public sector really needs to do is be multidisciplinary. In the private sector, when we talk about AI, that's very often like, your data scientist, your lawyer and your ethical experts, and the domain expert, so whoever is working on the particular area. Now, all of them are necessary in the public sector, but we also need to bring in public administration experts, social scientists. We've had very many years now in the public sector where that type of expertise hasn't really been seen to be important, because we're in this digital rush, right? We want to be more like the private sector. Yes, there are many areas we want to bring in, and expertise we want to bring in from the way the private sector works that we really need to be better at. But we also need to remember the fundamentals of public administration, which have kind of sometimes got lost along the way, and they will be super important for AI. So, like the examples, it's about Siri and the child benefit fraud case. Perhaps if there had been public administration experts, social scientists involved in those throughout the project, that mightn't have happened.
You can give a wider perspective.
Yeah, it's a much wider perspective and much more kind of looking at, well, what questions should we be asking here? What should we be thinking of? And when ideas come up, because there's so many ideas, anything is possible, in a way, in terms of really transforming the public sector. But we also need to have those questions in the background. And that expertise in the background to kind of help to ask this, and not see it as a negative that these questions are being asked, but seeing it as a positive, seeing it as a long-term benefit. And I see there is a change in the public sector towards, particularly in the large public bodies, to embrace this more.
And can you talk a little bit about maybe the difference, us being the Irish Norwegian Chamber of Commerce, can you talk a little bit about the difference between Norway and Ireland, and can Norway learn from Ireland? Can Ireland learn from Norway?
Yeah, I suppose there's two things that pop into my head there. There's a huge difference between the Norwegian and the Irish public sector in terms of how they're going to use AI, because the Norwegians have enormous amounts of data.
Yeah,
right.
Data is the new oil.
And Norway has had a policy since the 60s and 70s to collect huge amounts of data on the Norwegians and all activities in the state, and that was to build the welfare state. Now,
and Ireland, for anyone who isn't, so I don't think they have this in Ireland. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but as soon as you move to Norway, you're given a number, and that number, I have a bank account, I can rent a car, get a doctor, everything. So I'm giving away all that information. Yeah. It's amazing. It makes life very, very seamless. But of course, there's another part to it.
Yes. And that's the point, right? So it's this personal identification number that we all get. So from birth So my children, the second they were, registered, they have this number, and it literally follows you throughout life in every domain, and also over now a lot more even into the private sector. So it's not just the public sector. So in theory, you could link every piece of, and follow the crumbs for every person through this number, right? So the temptation there is, you can imagine, because what we could do for health, what we could do for tax, what we could do for, making sure that vulnerable people got, got the services that they deserve. So the temptation is huge. But also that whole invasive, it could also go the other way. Like China, for example, So we have a real responsibility here in Norway to think about how that can be done, and because it's so tempting, because it's so exciting, because we can see these really amazing types of services, we really have to have this extra responsibility to ask even more questions in Norway than would need to be asked in Ireland. I mean, I think that's a big difference. Right.
And you've said that's here in Norway, we trust, we're very lucky. We really trust our government.
Yeah.
And Irish people, maybe it's just we just love asking questions. We're not maybe as able to trust. We're a little bit more cynical maybe. But that's something that I've heard you speak about? That's created a difference. Yeah,
I think that's a huge difference. So we don't get, my experience in Norway is, and this is just now my experience, this is not based on any research that I or others have done, but very much that we don't get questions from the outside. We don't get questions. So we have to actually ask them ourselves within the public sector. And that isn't always easy. It's not always easy to ask questions. It's not always easy, so we don't get that pressure from the outside that I think the Irish public sector, følger på kroppen, as we say in Norwegian, very much. I think that there's always questions, discussion, debate around how the Irish public sector is operating, how they're using money, how they're using data. And there's a lot more, the public is much more of a watchdog than I think the public in Norway is. So that trust, yes, it's an asset, and it's something that we really need to maintain, but can also, if we don't ask the questions internally in the public sector and be critical to ourselves and engage with, for example, academia to get those questions, it could be to an extent a liability that we don't have, that we have so much trust. So that's a balance that needs to be done there. I suppose I have one example here in Norway about, trying to, which I suppose little helpful here is NAV, which is the largest public body in Norway. It's the welfare agency. They now have a project with actually the law department where I'm doing my PhD in the University of Oslo, to help them actually to ask these critical questions, to consider the questions that they need to consider, because of course they're dealing with all welfare in Norway. And if they get this wrong, they do not want to be in, they've learned as well from the Netherlands, and that's the point as well about how we need to learn from each other in other countries. So
citizens assemblies, citizen panels, they play a part.
Yes, and here is where Ireland is ahead of the game here. Very much. They were one. I think they were the first, if not, certainly one of the first countries to introduce citizen panels. And they haven't done one, I think, yet for AI, but that's not the point. The point is that this idea of engaging with different sectors of society to bring them in and have deep discussions around particular dilemmas. And AI is really ripe there, actually. And Bergen is doing one. I'll be observing at it. I think it's next weekend. On AI and the dilemmas
but it also creates such a sense of ownership and empowerment, because a lot of the language, a lot of the technology, depending on what age you are or how busy you are, you just kind of let it go. Whereas if it's a citizens' assembly, if it's inviting you to take part, you really can own it.
Yeah, and you get into the dilemmas, right? You get into the deep questions like, is this okay? Is this appropriate? So, you can say, okay, we're considering this type of use of AI, we're considering we'd have to use this type of data. Is that okay? Or does that give you kind of a bad feeling? And you can have a real open discussion about that with all members of society. Because the problem is, like, the people who talk mostly about this, let's say in the news or whatever, that it's quite, we're talking, I suppose, in a sense, the elites, right, who work with this very often, who, might be researchers and earn the money doing this. We need to get deeper down into society. We need to reach all members of society to really try and work out, well, what's appropriate, what's not appropriate, what's okay, what's not okay. And actually, and the other one, just to finish there on this point, is also the question, we might be too restrictive, we might be too careful and conservative in the public sector. Maybe actually we should be using this an awful lot more. And that's the other question as well.
Okay. That's an interesting. I don't know if I can go there.
But I suppose sector is known to be conservative.
To look at. Yes.
Yeah.
That's okay. But listen, we've actually been talking for over half an hour, which it just flies by. I'd really love to hear you just. Unfortunately, we don't have loads of time to go deep, but around the green transition, how AI is supporting the green transition, be it with smart cities, because as we spoke before, it's not about being negative towards AI. We recognize the benefits. So it'd be great if you could just say a few words around the smart city agenda and how AI is supporting that.
Yeah, there's the two sides to this debate, because AI also uses a lot of energy. Right, digital actually uses a huge amount of energy. I mean, we know that data centers, are using enormous amounts of electricity, and other types of power. But at the same time, you've got this, and this is the balance, right? We always need to kind of look at it. At the same time, you have smart cities where they're using sensors, technology to actually do energy management, to do water management, for example, resources, a lot of sensor-based technologies, traffic management, traffic congestion, public transport. Instead of sending the buses around and around and around, it can be done much more intelligently. And all of those are opportunities.
At the moment in Oslo, we have a water shortage. We're all being told, we're getting messages through our mobile phones, please mind your water, turn off the tap. My children are on me 24/7, Mom, the tap. How does AI help us there?
Well, that's going to be about water management. And at the end of the day, I mean, I'm far from a water management expert, but there will be ways of using it to predict when the most water is being used, where it's being used the most, and how that can be managed, where it can be targeted going forward. And also the thing is that smart cities, like everything, has a dark side as well, because in that case as well, then they have the capacity probably to be able to predict who is using too much water, right?
Yes.
So, and then that becomes that question again about when is it too invasive, and when is the public interest? So those questions always need to come in, because that's what AI can do. AI can know exactly who does not turn their lights off, in their apartment or in their house. Who's running their tap. So be careful, it won't be just your kids after you. So, and the question then has to be, if we leave this just up to whether the technology can do this or not, that's what's going to happen. Whereas if we get a balanced, bring in the different types of expertise, we can do this, hopefully.
And I suppose as a citizen, getting those text messages, being aware of managing the resources, obviously water is so important, that's you playing your part as a citizen, and that can engage more people, and that's a positive.
Yeah, exactly. So, and how do we do that? That's the question in all of these examples. How do we do that? But first, what has to come first is the awareness of we need to think broader around all of this to be able to engage.
Heather, thank you so much. Very important question. When is your thesis going to be complete, and will people be able to when can we read it? And I know that you have a lot of published articles already, so I'm going to put some links on the Irish Norwegian Chamber of Commerce LinkedIn page, so you'll definitely find them there, as well as a recording. But yeah, so when is the big handover?
Well, in theory, a year and a half left, but as I said, because it's an article based, it's progressive. So the articles that you'll share afterwards, they all contribute to the thesis. They're part of the thesis. So,
fantastic.
And that's why I chose the article base, because this area is changing so dramatically. Also, because I want to feed results back into the Digitalisation Agency along the way, and not wait 4 years until.
And we kind of need it, yeah.
Yeah, we don't have time.
We're not going in that energy of being urgent. We're being urgently reflective.
And asking the questions. And I mean, that's where, as I said, that's where the innovations are going to come from too, is from these reflections. If we just keep doing gung-ho into everything, we need the innovations to do this properly. And it's those companies that will thrive and survive. That's what I think too.
Brilliant. Yeah. So great to talk to you, Heather. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much for having me. This was great. Yeah.
Brilliant. We're going to have a little break over the summer, but we'll be back in the autumn with more exciting speakers. And if you haven't already followed the Irish Norwegian Chamber of Commerce on LinkedIn, please do.